Welcome back, and we're moving into our first conversation for today, finding out more about the role of the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee and their ongoing risk assessment exercise. We're joined at this time by Clare, who is the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you for having me here and representing the committee. We want to discuss this very, very important project being undertaken and how people understand the implications for the country and for themselves.
In that case, then, begin by talking to us a bit about the project itself.
All right, so this is it's an undertaking with perhaps close to 100 people involved. And it's began last year and continues perhaps until early next year. What it does is it follows the recommendation of the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force. That's the primary money laundering authority in the world. And their first recommendation is that countries should have this kind of review undertaken. It's a risk-based approach to determining vulnerable and the extent the threats may be from money laundering within your jurisdiction. You have to have that in place. It's not an academic exercise, something that you have to have in place.
Now, this seems to be taking a step backward to assess where we are, especially given the fact that we have had cases of money laundering being taken up by the FIU, and the FIU has been in place for quite some time. Right. Why until now we undertake this assessment?
Well, one of the things to bear in mind is that this is a changing game. Organizations who or countries who are subject to the FATF are reviewed from time to time to ensure that they comply. So it's not just the case of the FATF putting out a recommendation. What they will actually do is to use what is called the mutual evaluation process to determine whether or not you complied with the recommendation. Now, Belize went through this in 2011, going through 2013. And I will tell you guys, this was quite horrible experience for Belize at the time. That time they were doing the third round review to determine whether you had the elements in place. We are scheduled to do our fourth round in 2021. And so we have to take a step back now and make sure that we have everything in place, because that fourth round review will be far more significant. It will test effectiveness, not just whether you have laws, because you can have laws in place, but of course, there's no, exactly. So we have to get an early start. It's 2021, but we have seen what has happened with other countries who have had the unfortunate experience of not being prepared.
I can recall a couple of years ago, indeed, well, in my other capacity as a journalist, having covered stories with the Financial Intelligence Unit on this specific move with the FATF and all the measures that were put in place.
Right.
Looking back, would you be able to share some of the impacts or the effects of this particular change on the Belizean financial landscape insofar as money laundering is concerned?
That's a good point. In the past, because as I mentioned, it's a constantly evolving process. So at what point we were looking at your traditional financial institutions, because what is money laundering? It's the placement of tainted funds within these institutions, the layering of the funds to make sure that it distances itself from the tainted source, and then integration back into the society. These money launderers, they get smart. They don't, when you interdict them at one location, they don't go away. They try to find new ways. So traditionally we were looking at the banks, insurance companies, other financial institutions and so on. Well, a few years ago, the FATF said, you have to go a step further. You now have to look at what is referred to as DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions. So this includes casinos, NGOs and NPOs, the free zone, and a number of professionals like accountants and attorneys, people who deal in real estate, and consider this one, motor vehicle dealers.
Yeah.
There are opportunities there for money laundering, and we did not properly assess these particular sectors. So this present iteration will focus significantly on these other sectors, because for many of them, they have no knowledge of a compliance regime, what to look for, what to report. So that was a very good point that we needed to have the people of Belize be aware of.
Now, you're working with different working groups at this time, right?
Right,
For the assessment.
Yes.
Explain to us a bit about the rollout of the assessment itself.
Right, so it involves three parts. The first part would be gathering data. And this is done through a variety of ways, interviews, questionnaires, and so on. So as you mentioned, we have 6 working groups dealing with threats and vulnerabilities, insurance, banking, and a couple of other sectors. These persons are meeting, these are public officers from the customs, from immigration, from a whole variety of sectors. And they're assessing the existing data to define typologies, occurrences, trends. And what they will do is eventually put all of these reports, which will be consolidated, evaluated, and then, of course, we will then be able to establish what are the gaps. For example, a person who has a business in the free zone. As I had mentioned before, there may be some laws on the books that require that certain entities maintain books and records. But beyond just keeping books and records, do they have a compliance officer? Is there a compliance regime? And we don't know unless we go and we ask them. And ask them to be very, very candid.
That was going to be my point, because essentially, from what I've read, the assessment is trying to find your weak spots. You're trying to find where you need to reinforce or perhaps allow for more enforcement in particular areas. But when you bring together agencies, not everybody is always willing to have full disclosure to say, well, sometimes we don't check the legitimacy of X, Y, or Z, or the source of X, Y, or Z. And really, that's where the infiltration of these types of illicit activities will start from. How do you ensure that the information provided in the risk assessment is accurate?
Well, that's going to be a challenge, and we are seeing that already. I mean, we're getting information from these persons, but from within the public service itself, within the FIU, within the central bank, what kinds of records have we been keeping? Yeah, we keep records, but do they address all of the requirements? And right now, that's what we're seeing. So what happens is this. We hope to finalize this first round of determination by next year, January or so on.
Let me ask a question here. From a layman's point of view, if I may, and then you'll enlighten me accordingly, right? I think we have been able to notice significant changes in terms of being able to conduct certain financial transactions either at the bank or elsewhere. For one, if you want to or intend to deposit a significant sum of money in the bank, you now have to disclose the source of that particular fund. Let's say you sold a vehicle, or you sold a piece of property, you'd have to show the paperwork that shows or indicates that the money was legitimately received through a financial transaction. Similarly, if you're intending to send money via Western Union, for instance, you can no longer, let's say, send an unlimited amount. You have to
Right.
work within a finite quantum.
Right.
And even withdrawing your own
And
money,
even
which I think
withdrawing.
is
And-
more
and
to
of
the
course-
ire of everybody.
And
yeah.
people get upset
Of
about
course.
it. Yeah, but
Can you shed some light on that?
yeah, I mean, here's the deal, and this is something that persons need to understand, that this is not just an academic exercise. I had said the institutions themselves are under the gun. Banks particularly have what are called correspondent banking relationships. If you don't have those, you can't operate in the international financial sector. So their banks, their correspondent banks, are saying to them, you have to have this in place. And if you don't, we will not do business with you. And that is part of the de-risking effect that we're seeing. I'm quite certain you would have covered on this show the fact that all our commercial banks at one point,
We're at
like
risk.
perhaps outside of Scotia, were at risk and have only recently gotten back some correspondent banking relationships. But you have to now be very careful. So when the customer goes and he says, well, I want to withdraw $10,000, and the bank says, please tell me why. And you say, oh my God, that's my funds. There is a reason. It's not but because the government is trying to get in your business. But the banks themselves have to account to their correspondent banks in regards to their customers. If you are tainted the banking system in Belize and they're operating in Mexico or the United States, by extension, they were tainted as well. So
It's a compliance issue.
yeah, it's very big.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, some banks don't even want to deal with certain businesses anymore. Some banks are de-risking from casino money, what are called money service businesses like your Western Unions and so on, and even money lenders. Because this is such an international issue. It's very big.
The penalties are significant as well.
That's what has happened with some of the big banks, you
Yeah.
know. And so they're de-risking. They're
And the
saying,
money they make from more banks
That's
just
right.
isn't worth it.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
You know, and I think this is important. You know, one of the things we know is that there is also an international approach in being able to have more rigid systems in place to flag potential money laundering, but also to flag funds that may be used for terrorism activities.
Right.
And I always find that sometimes we feel so far removed from what's taking place. But if we look right within the Caribbean with the recruitment that takes place
Right.
in Trinidad, for example, you know, we know that it isn't something so far away from us.
Of course.
This assessment also includes terrorism threats.
Financing, yes.
Tell us about that.
Right. So, but you reference the cases there in Trinidad and so on. You don't have to go so far.
Yeah.
Right here in Belize, it was on the news. There was a person who was, of course,
Yes.
yeah. So, the question now is: this is a FATF heightened kind of alert as well, especially after 2001. That those the September 2001 thing.
9/11.
Yeah, so you're required now to monitor that typology. It's a little bit different from your traditional money laundering because terrorist financing often occurs not with big sums of money. It's stacking, it's small transactions being sent to one particular person or group of persons, and then you see the networking where they come back and they pool those funds, and that's how they get their monies. So you would think that something is innocuous, you know, I mean, somebody sending $500 Western Union to the same person over and over and over. That's what we're seeing.
Can it be argued in a sense, you have, for instance, family members in the States who send remittances back to the country via that kind of a transaction where every week, if the person can afford it, sends $500 back home via Western Union or MoneyGram or whichever other source. Can it be argued from that perspective?
Well, most, I would venture, more than 95% of these transactions are legitimate. What we're asking for is not for you to discontinue that. It's just for you to have the elements in place. Identity information, the purpose and so on. Is that person working? We have seen right here at the FIU, when we have looked at what is called suspicious transaction reports. We see, why, can you explain to me, why would somebody be at Western Union, say, here on Coney Drive, sending $500 to somebody who is on Neilspen Road, to another Western Union? Why don't you also stake the money?
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that alerts you that something is not quite right here.
Yeah.
So, but going forward, you
How do we
reference
assess
these
the
lists.
risk?
First of all, there are a couple of lists that are published. I don't know if you're familiar with an OFAC list. It's called the Office of Foreign Assets Control. That's the U.S. Treasury. And they post a list updated every week. Persons who are designated as terrorists and so on, or drug dealers and money launderers and so on. And the UN itself, the UN National Security Council has a list itself. And these are posted. So one of the things that we do with the system is to ensure that they monitor these lists. Right?
So you're working with these different groups, you provide them a survey, and let's talk about the progress after you have completed your assessment. So you're finding your risks, and I believe it's at 3 different levels, low, medium, and high.
That's right.
And then you come up with your plan of action. Talk about the timeline for this. And most importantly, I don't think we finalized who all are involved in the working groups at this point.
Right, so NAMLC itself, let's look at that. Like I said, NAMLC is chaired by the FIU, and it includes the DPP, Financial Secretary, Governor of the Central Bank, the Office of the Supervisor of Insurance, Controller of Customs, Income Tax, certainly the Attorney General, and the, I think I might have missed it, I think the CEO in the Ministry of National Security. So it's persons from these particular elements of NAMLC who sit on the working groups. The International Financial Services Commission as well, very, very important, because they supervise the offshore sector. So you have various regulators, like for banking and so on, it's the central bank. For insurance, it's the Office of the Supervisor of Insurance, and for offshore, it's the IFSC. The FIU does everybody else. So these groups are working. They will complete their assessments and reports by July, August. The analysis will begin, and
it's self-assessment.
Yeah, it's self-assessment. It's very, very frank discussion. It's very, very sensitive information. It will produce a report which will go to the cabinet, and it will go with a recommended action plan and recommendations. But it will also lead into a more comprehensive NRA in 2018.
Now, what will this mean for the regular Belizean person? Because when we spoke about the compliance with the bank, I think that was one of the first times that people started to say, okay, this is how the effects of money laundering or the cracking down on money laundering will affect me. I have to go update my account or they will deactivate it, and I have to source my funds or say what I'm going to spend my $5,000 or $10,000 on. What are some of the other implications you can tell people they can expect with a more stringent approach to anti-money laundering efforts?
I think it's all for the, sometimes growth involves a little bit of pain. Traditional approaches to doing business might have to be put aside. One of the things that I saw the Prime Minister announced last week, in his, the week before I think it was, when he spoke with the Chamber, was this announcement that government is going to be concentrating more on e-governance. And it seeks, for example, to have a lot more digital approach to transactions. Record keeping is important. Cash transactions are something that we have to kind of like shy away from as much as possible. Do you know that in India, Prime Minister Modi removed from circulation 500 rupee notes and above? Because when they did their assessment, that's what they were finding. There's a lot of cash that was being used for money laundering. It's not very traceable. But if you are using direct deposits, if you're using checks and credit cards and so on, then that lends itself to a better regime, you know. So I think what people should expect would be move to that kind of identity of transactions. Right now, if you deal with the government of Belize, if you deal with the Treasury, payments are made direct deposit to your bank accounts, and that's a very good thing. So that's one thing. So I think we have a responsibility as well to deal with government departments, and the FIU will be making some recommendations for things like having internal checks, audits, making sure that you don't have these scandals where there always seems to be somebody who is pilfering funds. All of this uplifts the perception of risk in your society. I need to emphasize that this is very important. People who are dealing with Belize have this perception. Now, the perception might not be entirely true, but we have a responsibility to uplift that perception. So
Is it safe to say that in terms of the risks that are being faced in the financial sector in this particular case versus the perception that is out there that it goes hand in hand with corruption in a sense?
right.
Is it safe to make that kind of a comparison?
Oh, absolutely.
Where, in my opinion, I believe that the idea of e-governance is long overdue for Belize,
Right.
where you can transact online and you know that it's safe. You don't have to really take into consideration the risk of dealing hand to hand with somebody else who may not necessarily deposit that money.
Right.
And that person, as you said, is exposed to pilfering funds because they're dealing with cash directly.
Right.
It also makes the services a lot more expedient, for instance, because you can wake up at midnight and decide you'll pay a bill to the government, and you just
And that's it. It's
punch in your information,
Right.
and it's
Yeah.
as safe as it
But,
gets.
but one thing that you touched there, which is extremely important, is the synergy thing. Because you mentioned, I'm quite certain you would have discussed UNCAC and that convention. The FIU is a part of the board for UNCAC. And we have a similar interest in ensuring that the FATF has identified like the top 5 typologies in, one of them is corruption. The other one is drug trafficking. Certainly fraud and embezzlement and that sort of thing. These are your top 5, and we have a responsibility to work closely with this effort to ensure that, for example, when laws are passed, they don't just address one particular hole in one area, but they look at a comprehensive jurisdictional approach to fixing things. So, yeah, going forward, I think that by 2018, when we are able to publish this report, eventually the public will get a chance to see some of what, it's going to be integrated, but you're going to see what's coming out of the report and what needs to be fixed.
Now, of course, it's in its beginning phases, but I just want to ask, based on what has been the international requirements that are being mandated by the international body that you speak of, which are we furthest from in terms of being able to make that achievement?
Which
international requirement?
Well, we are focusing on one, which is the FATF recommendation number 1, that risk-based approach has to be done across all sectors.
Okay.
So what it basically says is this: you don't have any foolproof stopgap kind of approach. There's always going to be money laundering, and there are limited resources. So what you have to do is to take the risk-based approach, which allows you to figure out where are the highest risks, and then apply the resources there.
To prioritize.
Right. So we think, from my perspective, I think our banks have done a superb job. But there are so many other institutions or NGOs and NPOs. Many of them don't keep records. They don't have audited financial statements. They don't have a compliance officer. They don't have a compliance regime, a manual. It's not checked to see and tested to see if it's effective. That's the biggest challenge for us right now.
All right, so as you pointed out, last week was the start of, you had your first mixer.
Yeah, well, we've been meeting with the other sectors one-on-one, you know. from about January, and then it continues. So we ask people when we come talking to you, this is not punitive. We want to engage, we want to have a frank discussion.
So if somebody is candid in their interview and speaks of not being able to follow protocol or not choosing not to follow protocol in particular areas, there are no
sanctions on this. The FIU and the NAMLC, we are interested in working with you to strengthen this thing. This is for the jurisdiction. This is for the life and for the soul of Belize. We want to make sure that we have an upgraded perception about this country's ability to interdict money laundering.
Okay. Well, thank you for stopping in and letting us know about this process. And of course, as you pointed out, the plan of action and the final report will be completed sometime in 2018.
Yes, and then we move from there.
Okay. Thank you for stopping in.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right. We're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, it's for an update from the Western Regional Hospital. That's coming up.